coming in, if people could maybe move a little bit together. So a little bit Tibetan Indian style. Not to have 1 meter around you or something. Thank you so much.
Is there?
Also, for the people who just arrived, there's a lot of space over here. Yeah. And if people could give us the small cushions, some people have 2 or 3. Thank you so much.
Yesterday, Geshe will start this session by reciting a prayer, Refuge and Bodhicitta. So the meaning of the words of this prayer is, until I'm enlightened, I take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merit I generate by practicing giving and so forth, may I become a Buddha for the benefit of all sentient beings. So again, I will recite this in Tibetan 3 times.
Sophia Jonah, Janchu Badu, Dani Capsuchi, Dari Jinso, Dipe, Somanki, Rola, Benji, Sandia, Gruparishu, Chodan, Sophia Jonah, Janchu Badu, Dani Capsuchi, Dari Jinso, Dipe, Somanki, Rola, Benji, Sandia, Gruparishu, Sandia, Chodan, Sophia Jonah, Janchu Badu, Dani Capsuchi, Dari Jinso, Dipe, Somanki, Rola, Benji, Sandia, Gruparishu.
Kazangi Cho, Ichini, Nukobolo Juki, Zawashira, Rajin, Shibana, Kapani, Teaching Java Chumoka, Tene Tomani, Shes, Tene Tapa, Tene Umena, House, or that's Tishi soon. That's it, a boogie, that teaching Java Chumoka, Tene Tomani, Shes, Tita Dadi, Takaza, Shibata.
continue with the teachings from yesterday. So in relation to that, Nagarjuna said in his fundamental wisdom in the 24th chapter, that which is dependently arisen is explained to be emptiness. That being dependently imputed is the middle way. So with regard to the first two lines, that which is dependently arisen is explained to be emptiness, while Geshe already explained that yesterday.
That is any tension to Rojo, Tomani to Shis, the Kazan, Bernata, Tombegi Ton, Geshe on Duzane, Kazan, Chanzil, Chan, Shevada, that machine tension.
So with regard to these two lines, these first two lines, that which is dependently arisen is explained to be emptiness. Now in particular with regard to emptiness, from the point of view of emptiness, Geshe yesterday used the example of the scissors. So he said, okay, so I should better get out those scissors. So with regard to those three parts that these scissors are made of, we can all understand that none of those parts are the scissors. And we also know that there is nothing else other than those three parts. There's no other entity or no other phenomenon that we can point at as saying that those are the scissors. So therefore, since we cannot find anything to point at with regard to what the actual scissors are, so therefore we can say the scissors do not exist in reality or in and of themselves. So therefore, saying that it doesn't exist, that in reality they don't exist, these scissors, well then emptiness is quite easy, really easy, it can be easily understood. And then with regard to another object other than the scissors, if you take the I, if you take the self, well then it's a little bit more difficult, but nonetheless it's not that hard to understand that the I is none of the aggregates, it's not the collection of the aggregates, it's not any single aggregate, so that's actually also not that hard to understand. So if that is emptiness, then the kind of idea you may come up with is that emptiness is actually not that difficult. If that's not hard to understand, then someone may say emptiness is not that hard. So then, therefore, the great Kadamba master called Dumdumba, so with regard to him, he explained that those who know emptiness, those who realize emptiness, they will be able to generate compassion, they will be able to reduce their afflictions and so forth. And in response to that, a disciple said to Dromdamba, well, why is it then there are not that many people who realize emptiness? There are not that many people that we know have realized this. No, Tolkien ko leke je mo bu yore de yine ma
Toni to shingi Toni to so la ne de yine video zo ni chetandi da mi mo ki ran cha che ni ran cha de ji de ne ka de res.
Sorry, I misunderstood. So Geshe said that actually someone said to Dromdamba, well, actually, if it's why is it that there's still so many people they can talk about emptiness, but they still have afflictions, etc. And so Geshe says, well, this is just emptiness that comes from the mouth. in the sense that they haven't really understood it. They may be able to talk about it, etc., but they haven't really realized it, fully understood it, so that it becomes an antidote to their affliction. So once you have a sense from deep within your mind, a deep understanding of emptiness, then your mind will change. That is, your afflictions will be reduced. There will be some change. So there's a story of someone who learned, who kind of thought about emptiness a lot. He hadn't really studied about it much, but he had trained himself in emptiness, as in like he has thought about it a lot. And so at some point, when he experienced some fear in his mind, he started analyzing what is it that is experiencing this fear. So he started searching for that entity, and as a result of that, not being able to find anything, his fear was reduced. And so there are stories of those who meditate, for instance, for 20 days on emptiness. So previously, of course, they learned about emptiness, they studied about it, and then they did some retreat on that. And as a result of doing this retreat, they then shared this experience they had, saying, well, previously someone harmed me and I got angry, I got upset, but actually that doesn't make sense. It's embarrassing that I reacted in that way because of the understanding that they had. So that shows that their meditation was effective to some degree, that it actually affected their mind because of saying what Geshe said, so that they had been affected in that way, that they thought it was wrong that they reacted to the harm of another person in that way.
And then
there's another story of a monk who had even meditated more on emptiness, more than the person that Geshe mentioned before. So he had meditated even more on emptiness, learned more about it. So, in general, we consider ourselves to be more important, and we forsake the welfare of others because of the sense of ourselves being so important. So with regard to the sense of I am so important, so taking Geshe as the example, so with regard to Geshe's I, that refers to the person sitting here on this throne. So this person, so Geshe taking himself as the example, so himself, Geshe saying that I myself feel to be so important, I consider myself to be so important, while another person, I consider them to be less important. But why is that? We're actually the same. I want to be happy and don't want to suffer, and the other person wants to be happy and does not want to suffer. So why is there that difference in terms of considering one to be more precious than the other? So if we analyze this well, if we examine this well, we come to the conclusion that the reason for why this is more precious is because this is I and this is not I. So that is the reason for considering ourselves to be more precious.
Marangi do che shawl mato, drinking when we will need to tone, the yo do sit that there's some sort of. Did you do that? Kendigi yo are chaining in chair, the Tadachigo Mari, Kiduni, your machine kitchen, Toma Mevan, Koyalor to social charity. DJ Goedi, Big Mama, Big Aris, you are the cherry. The yo are the Marangulo truly cherry model, doing this to the yo mari jammed. The Jamba Tahara and Polisin that goes to the cigar. That double to me Koya water, and much everything, Norsha, some lot in the corner, and some little test and then you do like.
So, with regard to this situation where we differentiate between ourselves and others, so if we think about emptiness with regard to this particular, or the sense of being different, ourselves differentiating between ourselves and others, if we really think about it, then we come to the conclusion that this difference is only created by the mind. It cannot be found from the side of the object. And so the sense of differentiating, of considering one person closer to yourself, so the eye is kind of closer and the other person is further away, well, we're basically born with that. Not only are we born with this, we've had that sense since beginning of time. We naturally have that sense. But then if we think about this, if we consider this and examine this, we can come to the conclusion that we're mistaken about this, that this is not in accordance with reality. And thus, once we understand this, that this is just coming from the mind, this is just from the point of view of the appearance to the mind, that there's this differentiation, then it is said that this feeling, that naturally a feeling of closeness is generated. Understanding our own mistakes, we feel naturally closer to another person. We understand that we were wrong and develop some sense of closeness. This is how it's explained. So therefore, if we think about this again and again, once our mind is affected by this way of reflection, by that type of reflection, then a special feeling with regard to this idea will arise. So it's difficult, of course, to generate that kind of feeling, but actually, in comparison to other things, it's not that difficult. And as Geshe explained before, if you become familiar with this idea that the object is not findable, etc., well then after some time it's actually not that difficult to get a sense for that. But what is more difficult, what is actually harder than that, is to get an understanding of how the scissors exist. So saying that the scissors do not exist in this way, but then the question is, what is the scissors? How does it exist? That is harder to understand. We can't say it's not there, it doesn't exist. So actually it's not, actually from deep within, we don't actually think it's not really there. But actually there are those that feel when we talk about phenomena do not exist from their own side, it means the same as if saying they don't exist. So they believe that those mean the same thing, not existing from their own side and not existing at all. So actually they just say from the mouth basically, they just kind of have a superficial sense that phenomena do not exist, that the scissors do not exist. Because if you were to ask them, is therefore fire not hot? Is water not cold? And you were to ask them to put their hand in fire, like to touch their hand, touch the fire, they won't do it because from deep within there's no sense that it's non-existent, that fire is not hot, for instance. If I say I don't talk, I don't speak, I don't exist as being speaking, that's there's a contradiction by saying so, saying that that doesn't take place. Okay. It's the same as saying I'm not speaking. Like saying I don't speak is like I don't speak is the same as saying I'm not speaking, but actually it's Geshe is speaking.
제선다 왜 쟤는 이거 뭐래 우리는 지내봐디 다 타셔 주고래 네 라마도 같이 요래스 다 디기 렌디카 디지도 아니 신의 미담미담 this things are 주고
So basically, when we search for an object, when we look for an object, we cannot find it. But then what is difficult is to establish how it exists. So there are different explanations with regard to how it exists, and we're moving on to a subtler level, a deeper kind of level, when explaining how phenomena then exist.
다 디가나 우리는 다 지워지 우리는 지도 매나 아 간데스 통보하레스 먼저 디리 가르치는 제거레스 뒤에 용식으로.
And on top of that, the question that arises is if the objects do not exist in reality, well then, how do we perceive them? How come we think about objects? How come that we can perceive them, we can see them?
딜레도 그 차시에다 무매디 바차 소시스는 바차 요바다 유기도 차시죠. 딜레 때문에 이rol을 우리는 좀 매네 통해 요래 배나 다 토요를 미 통하는 신.
So with regard to the reason for why we see things, so it could be because of imprints, having left imprints in the past, because of the parts of the object, those parts of the object coming together. So on the basis of that, we perceive things. So that's like, that would be like you can see a person when there's a scarecrow. So okay, so let's talk about like a robot, for instance. So nowadays we have like robots, so like machines that really look like a living being. So in the past they were like you had scarecrows, and nowadays you have like robots basically that look like human beings. And so because of our imprints, we perceive that robot to be like a human being. And so from the external appearance, they're very similar to a human. The only difference is that a human actually has a mind, but other than that, they're very similar.
로라 우리는 매네 로라 차야지 요인자 로라 차주 디기 토 디원도 제네 남샤디 요레스.
So therefore it's from the point of view of appearance, it's from the point of view of kind of being similar, and therefore from the point of view of appearance, from appearance to the mind, therefore we say the object is there.
제선 고불로주기다 지 숨바들라 데니 따바데스 들어와 텐진지 주카에 데니 동바니도 시스 동바니를 납사 다 동바이나 우리는 메나 메나 간데스 요레스 지와디 렌디라 데니 따비고 요레스 데니 따바데스.
So then therefore Nagarjuna says in the third line that being dependently imputed, that is the middle way. So having said previously, that which is dependently risen, that is emptiness, so that which is empty, therefore, how does it exist? It exists by way of being dependently imputed. So that is the middle way. So when we say it is imputed, it is designated or labeled. So here it's a dependence on a convention, it's a dependence on a term that we label something, that we designate something. So therefore explaining what Nagarjuna says, Chandrakirti then says that different from that, therefore phenomena exist by way of not being analyzed, not being examined. So without examining, without analyzing, then phenomena exist. They appear to the mind as in like they exist through in that way, as in like not analyzing them, not examining them, we can say that they exist.
Didn't so the Tata Shato Inza and didn't Umi no say Tata Leo.
So therefore, when you understand this, so phenomena do not exist from their own side, but they're not non-existent. So they do exist. They exist in dependence. They have dependently arisen. They're able to perform a function, but they don't exist from their own side. So this is what the last line therefore says. This is the middle way.
Oda Tenji any Tenji da Shi Jago Kazan Shuba Tenji Midawa Shi Che, Pentita Yimi Jumzengi, any Ramani Meva. Young Ramani Meva Yimbi Jumzengi, Tenji Sidi, Yon Shoba. That was true.
So therefore, as Genla explained previously, so there are 4 types of dependent arising. And because phenomena exist by way of those 4 types of dependent arising, therefore we say they do not exist from their own side. But we can also say, because they do not exist from their own side, therefore they exist dependently.
Shingi Kali Chini Lu Tuga to Chunjo, and then the Yagas Honogo Pele Tishita Yogures.
So basically, this is dependent arising, therefore, so dependent arising as well as the lack of inherent existence. So if you think about those again and again, then it will be natural. The natural process will be such that your negative states of mind, they will be slowly reduced, and your positive states of mind, they will slowly develop.
That the Yomba Janja Mahimba Chinia, Cheduniani, Dina Roni, Susugita, Katis Pejitayandu, I'm sure Jundu, Tatina, Suki, Denjeti, Katis Pejitayandu, Denjeti, Katis Pejitayandu, Ramuni may say that any Susugi, Kami Che, Duje, Turen, Katis Pejitayandu, or those in the Sanso Samtama Yinayam, Yamachi, shame.
But not just that, the next point that arises is how do we use this? How do we utilize this understanding of dependent arising? What do we do with this? What do we do with the understanding of phenomena not existing from their own side? So how to actually apply that? So this question then takes us towards how to practice, how to actually practice these ideas, kind of put them into practice.
Di Kadis Pishitani, Di Goa, the Nella Chache, Senator, the Soy, which is only Risha Samach, Di Jensevichella, Di Nikindu, Kadis Pishitakas.
So, for instance, yesterday Geshe talked about mutual dependence or interdependence. Geshe gave the example of an airport that appeared to be great in relation to something smaller, but smaller in relation to something greater. So, based on that, if you really understand, if you have a real understanding of that, now the question that arises is, how do you apply this? How can this be useful in terms of your practice?
So, of
course, everyone has their own attitude with regard to how they utilize this, how they use it. So here, Geshe will share his own personal view on how to actually apply this or utilize this idea. So to give the example that Geshe himself would like to share with you here is the example of, for instance, your own accommodation. If you're not happy with your own accommodation, you don't feel happy about it, and you're not satisfied with it. So at that time, usually you compare your situation with a better situation. This is how your mind usually works, as in like comparing it to something better. So if that is the case, if it's really better, well, you could just move there. If it was really better, you just move there. But if you cannot actually move, that's not a possibility for you to move to this different place, well then you can actually utilize the idea, you can use the idea or apply the idea of interdependence, of mutual dependence, and compare it to a worse place, and spend a week or two in a worse place. So after those 1 or 2 weeks in this worst place, when you return back to your place, this place which originally you thought was really horrible, now there's a sense, oh, this is nice, it's okay.
제가 같이 모시면지 아니 데스키오 민두스라네 아니 되잖아요. 아니 모시면지 다 사실 기본들이 참 됐어. 되는다도 예전에 된지 저기요 말했어. 그게 사실 들어왔어. 따라 들어왔어.
So some of Geshe-la's friends, like sometimes they stay in a place where they're not really happy, and so they suggest to go to a nicer place, to go somewhere nicer. And Geshe-la recommends not to go to a nicer place. It's better to go to a worse place.
제가 단다 양 지기 가스고래 뭐 뒤에 구셔지기 디시 다 그런 남바체 아니 좋아지 주세야 다 뒤서다 killing 거래 애녀유도 메다 뒤서 상당히 있어요.
So there's one monk who he's a Buddhist, and he accepts the existence of the 6 types of beings in different kind of realms of existence. So he accepts those beings who are in the hell realm. He accepts the existence of hell beings.
지선다 강에들이 제 답시 주는 내용인데 어디 디삼로과 녀원은 게요 가지 강에 제 가지는 녀원은 게요 가리어스디 그렇게 믿어서 그 관계를 말해줬어.
So when this monk experiences problems, he starts reflecting upon how it would be like to be reborn in the lower realms or in the hell realms. So he's thinking, I'm not reborn in the hell realms, so my situation is bearable. So he's able to deal with the problem by reflecting on the hell realm.
미션다든지 코로나다 또 치와든지 엔지든지 다 네버든지 엔라마 하진 그 가지 뭐 가지 진생은 녀는 다 부르고 그렇게 믿어서 그 충분히 차.
So in this, like if he is in a situation where someone who's more powerful, like harms him, for instance, so again when he experiences that kind of harm, still he thinks, well, at least I'm not born in the hell realm, so it's okay. So he's able to deal with that in that way.
제자다 디지디자네 디키니 그게 베나다 미지기 네버제베네 땅에 손다 딘지니 디지 동네니 제로 말이야. 디다 동네 춘춘 딘지 춘춘 제다 그 콘트사바이게 믿으시. 그야 디 요걸 콘트도 맞아요.
So he's basically able to deal with this anger in the sense that when someone harms him, he then thinks, well, at least I'm not in a worse state, such as a kind of a hellish kind of state. So therefore, there's no reason for him to get angry or upset. So he's able to deal with this anger and with his feeling of being upset in that way.
제자다 가수리다 이제 야, 나 제게 온다. 서서히 이제 친구인지 나 제게로나 뒤에 더 다시 친구식으로 자고가. 다야 다 나게 메시지들은 야 소소로 와 됐으니까 같이 해야 돼. 다 스스로 제가 와서 샤네 기본도. 최이나 그거지 샤리다 최대 팀도 다 야바고도 마자고도 스스로 그지 해도 디지고디 키지. 다마 됐자. 야바고도 지체.
So basically, there are different examples, other examples. For instance, if you find yourself to be very arrogant, well then just think of a person who has greater qualities. There's so many beings who have even greater qualities. And that kind of brings down that mind that feels so full of itself. Or when you feel really low about yourself, when then you reflect on someone who has less qualities, who is less fortunate and so forth. So basically, you try to keep your mind at a certain level. And at times you need to bring it down, at times you need to lift it up. So just check it out in terms of the situation, and then you can apply that kind of reasoning.
어떤 신진이 된제기 비차상 비주당에 두수요래 다음에 봤다 된제기다 외직이 다음에 봤다 잘하면 오지 못되기도 디상도 비주당에 있어요.
So likewise, different ideas with regard to dependent arising, you can apply them in such a way. So with regard to selflessness, so we can take dependent arising, like one aspect of that is the lack of independent existence. So then there are many different levels of that lack of independent existence. So from the point of view of that, to just apply this to different situations.
얘네 가수들의 가장 달라가는 신진의 지르다 돈이 최근지든 돈이 상당히 유입이 나오네 다다 계시쇼지 다 마디 인터넷 제제 ene samtam koe dike chijuji zigor.
So as Geshe talked about it yesterday, now in general we talk about emptiness. So all phenomena, there's as emptiness with regard to all phenomena. So we can talk about the lack of inherent existence of all phenomena. But here in particular, what we need to focus on is the fact that when we look for the I, it cannot be found.
디 근전지 거래에서나 에네 강에 용대의 참아 나시에들 차 도착기 디왕기 중대에 그랬어.
Why? Because any time we experience problems because of our holding on to the self, being attached to the self, and therefore problems and difficulties arise.
다디 베지타 도티지 쉬어이나 가수그레 미지기 키주베이나 자르와 슈부디 키조나 자 슈부데레 샤바이나 마마키바 요마레 콘로사이마레 베기직만 생투마레.
So why is this the case? Well, to tell you in short, this piece of napkin that Geshe just took. So actually, if someone were to take that away from him, were to tear it, take it away from him, then they would not get upset. Why not? Because Gela has no desirous attachment towards this object. If someone took his scissors though, so if they took them, they would break them, Gela would get slightly upset, would get slightly unhappy if someone took his scissors. Because Gela has a little bit, why is that? Because Gela has a little bit desirous attachment towards those scissors.
So
Geshe picks up this MP3 player, actually it's not his, but if it were his, because this is precious, he'd get really upset if someone were to take it and break it. So therefore, whether we're unhappy or not, in terms of someone harming an object or not, it all depends on the degree of attachment, the degree of desirous attachment we have towards the object. So therefore, if we have no attachment, if we have no desirous attachment for the self, then no matter what people do to the self, what they say about the self, etc., we won't get upset. We won't get scared, we won't get fearful, there won't be any fear, we won't get confused, we won't get angry. If there's no attachment for the self, then... So, seeing the problem as our attachment for the self, so because we have attachment to the self, therefore we experience problems. It's not just Buddhists, not just Buddhist philosophers who recognize that, but also some non-Buddhist Indian philosophers understand this. So some non-Buddhist philosophers, not all of them, but some of them say that when we say I, there's a sense that the I kind of refers to the body. So body or like the coarse types of awareness. So the sense of I or the sense of self, well that really refers to body and mind. So it's because we consider body and mind to be precious, therefore these non-Buddhist philosophers would say, therefore we experience problems. But actually, our body, that is not the I, that's not the self. So they say that, so actually they come to the conclusion that that body actually, that's not the actual I. So then they say, well, the actual I is something that exists separate from the body, from the mind. So a permanent, partless, independent entity. That is what they describe to be the I.
디지털에 나디 풍부들 로가요디 안 풍부들 내게 수부들 내려면 나는 내려 말했어. 나 그거 트레이닝에 타와들 수부 강해체 풍부 강해체 나 강해체요 말했어. 어디지 디자네 심 마기버디 파스 가서 디르트 샤디 세 아니 디지털 시가르다.
So due to this philosophy, because they say, well, if someone harms my body, they're actually not harming me, because the I exists as a separate entity, separate from the body as a permanent partless entity. So they basically are able to deal with the suffering the suffering that would ordinarily arise with regard to your body by saying, well, it doesn't harm them. Why? Because the self exists as a separate entity from the body.
다 다와디 디지털에 온도 다니야 그 비슷한시나야 벤도지 용서하 야 비슷한 마시나 파슈이제 수고를 쉬면도 컬을 쉬면서 들어와야 야 다시 쉬세 근데 수고세만도 컬세면서 비슷한 왔다는
So this kind of view, this non-Buddhist view, if you know to use it well, then it's okay. But you may also use it in the wrong way. Because you may justify your harming another person, kind of beating up another person, saying, well, it's only their body, their self is different. So by reason of that kind of philosophy, they may go and beat up the other person, kill them, saying, well, because the self is separate. So it's all about utilizing or using this idea in a correct way. So actually, if you yourself are being harmed, if you receive harm, then at that time, if you think, okay, they just harmed this body, but I'm not my body, the self exists as something separate, well, that would be all right. So what is their reason for accepting such an I? Well, they say actually the body or the aggregates, the physical and mental aggregates, they're changing all the time. So they say the self is permanent, but the aggregates, mind and body, they're impermanent in the sense that a former moment and a later moment are not the same. That moment by moment, those aggregates change. And so their argument is that unless there was a self that continued all the time, so in terms of body and mind being different, but a separate kind of I that does not change, if that didn't exist, then it wouldn't be possible to say, oh, I saw that yesterday. I saw that same person yesterday, as an example. That wouldn't be possible. So Gillen, with regard to this argument, Gillen says he also sometimes has his doubts. So his doubts with regard to the fact that actually the person yesterday and the person today, they're similar. But just because they're similar doesn't mean that they're the same. So we could just be mistaken with regard to our perception of that person. So actually there's a story in the scriptures, which the stories of the time of the Buddha. At the time of the Buddha, there was an elderly lady who was begging. She went around begging. and she was kind of dirty, neglected, she was quite dirty and so forth. So when she saw the Buddha, she kind of opened her arms and she was like, "My son," and wanted to embrace him. So the other monks, the elder monks, they were like, "Oh no, don't do that," because she was kind of, she looked kind of dirty and so forth. But then the Buddha actually allowed her to hug the Buddha. So the reason for her feeling like, "Oh, there's my son," and wanting to hug him, and eventually she did hug the Buddha, and she relaxed a little bit and then sat down and listened to the Buddha. Well, the reason for her wanting to hug the Buddha was, the Buddha explained that throughout many lifetimes, they had this relationship, her and the Buddha, in previous lifetimes, had the relationship of mother and son. So because of those imprints, she wanted to, or because of that, she wanted to hug the Buddha.
That the Luchoda, Kikotaka, Temason, Tichi, Amachita, Pomochi. Tako Pugu to Skidune, Pugu di Tona, Maganici. The Gina, that she would have and teaching a country that she would have said, Kati in a children, they showed it.
But then there's another situation that happened later in some western area of India. Geshe says he doesn't remember the name of the place. There was also a mother who gave birth to a girl. And from the moment the girl was born, she didn't have any feeling of closeness towards the girl. So usually, like a mother would feel very close to her child, but in that occasion, or at this time, there was no closeness between the mother and the child, and they were always fighting with each other. So over little things, they would always argue and fight with one another.
Any Pomodi Tarchi, that was some of the chimneys in Botamidala, and the virgin on the Nibit is Tuesday, Nibit hypnotist, or the Tony, any. Mama, Mama change it. Mama continue any pushing the coverage. I want to continue. But the any quick gentle.
And so at some point, this girl, she kind of left her mother and she went to travel. She went to travel around, and she met a hypnotist. And this hypnotist, she underwent hypnosis, and was able to see in a previous life, become aware of a previous life, and she understood that in a previous life, her and her mother were interested in the same boy. So they were in competition with each other, they were after the same boy. So somehow, in the meantime, the mother also found out that was the reason for her difficulty with the daughter. That was the same reason, because of that relationship they had in the previous life. So after they become both aware, when they met again, so they basically shared their experience, as in like sharing the idea of why they didn't get along, and then eventually they, because of having talked about it, they started to get along with one another. So if that is really true, if this really happened as it's been told in this story, well, actually, how could that be? Because those two beings, the mother and the daughter, and also in the other example, well, actually their body has changed. In the meantime, they've taken on a different body from one life to the next. And the mind is also always changing. So what is that continuum, unless it were like a permanent kind of entity, what would that continuum be that enables that situation, that makes it possible that this took place? But on the other hand, if such a permanent self were to really exist, well, then the self could never change. It could not get sick, it could not get better, it could not get liberated, so the self would never change if it really existed.
Shinda Juarela, Shindadi, Monzi Kundingi, Namanyam Sadi Remida, Lodi Dilama, Yango.
So, with regard to the I, saying this is the I, well, actually, when we think I, that does not refer to that kind of separate permanent partners I.
Dina Shinji Kazanda, that teacher Zimone, Mari, teacher Zimari, Tilo, Chaziko, Chazimone, the laws Shinda Juarela, that theatre was shadow.
So actually that would be like saying, well, this part is not the scissors, this part is not the scissors, this part is not the scissors. Oh, the scissors exist as a separate entity. It would be like that, kind of saying the scissors is something different, something separate. But that's actually difficult to believe, that the scissors exist as a separate entity that is permanent, that does not change. That is hard to believe, that instead of this object, there's something separate that is permanent. If that were the case, well then the table would be something totally different. The person teaching Dharma would be a different person. So it would be absurd in terms of all the objects as like existing as something separate.
And no one say mix it with those Penat Tizugi and is Mama Tigor, Tijiti, Taba in Chibu in Tijichila Muslim Tigomaris, Shinko.
But actually, from a Buddhist point of view, this view of the self as like being permanent, partless, independent, existing as separate from mind and body, that is not accepted. Why? Because it says it goes against reasoning, it goes against logic, in the sense that it doesn't make sense that there's such an I that doesn't change, that exists separately. So again, that previously gave some reasons for why it doesn't make sense. And so when we think I, on top of that, again, it says, on top of that, our sense of I, taking for instance animals who also have a general, a very natural sense of an I, they don't perceive their I as being something permanent, partless, and independent of mind and body. So actually, the sense of this person did this to me, they did that to me, I do this to them, etc. So the sense of I, if it really were the case that there was such a sense of a permanent, partless, independent self, that would be like saying we have a sense of the space in front of us being the I. And that's not the case. So from the point of view of reasoning, from the point of view of logic, that's why such a self can't exist. And so, why is it from the point of view of the purpose that there's no purpose for kind of following such a self? Well, the reason being that if we perceive the body and the mind to be impermanent, changing, and the self to be separate, like a separate permanent entity, that perception does not help us in our effort to reduce this attachment. Why can we not eliminate our attachment with regard to that? Because there's a sense, this is mine, this is my body, this is my mind. So unless this kind of attitude is changed, attachment in that way cannot be reduced, cannot be eliminated. So how can we remove this attachment towards this is mine, this, that, and the other? How can we reduce it? Eliminate it.
콜라니 자하고만 자유나 딱금 아리고만 자리 계셔 지기로 미디다 자시오 지기 제대시오 지기 디 균전 테스트와 그래서는 그게 고만 자리를 디나 채워라.
So to give you an example, for instance, Geshe says, if I were to own $100 and this person 100 rupees, so Geshe says I should be the one who has the US dollars. So I have $100 and the other person has 100 rupees. Well, actually, here from the point of view of the value of those two types of this money, it's obvious that the $100 are more precious, have a greater value than the 100 rupees.
이네다 크기 자하고만 자리다 내기 자하고만 자리디 린다치고지잖아.
Well, if both Genla himself and someone else had 100 rupees, well then the value would be the same.
제디 파게디 레네제 미키네키 마춘이 심데요 말에 개개디요 말.
But with regard to the other person's 100 rupees, Genla is not at all concerned about this other person losing the money, the money being torn, etc.
다디 기도나는 걸로만 그래가 신경제를 참아디지도.
But with regard to Geshe-la's own money, those 100 rupees that belong to Genla, well, these Genla will look after. He considers to be precious. He will look after.
디를 제제제 파게디를 제제 마치에 제거도 가능셔도 린다 집어지냐 다 제거 가능셔도서는 디니 말에 디니기리스 디모도 신의 굉장히도.
So therefore, why do we cherish those two different, well, we cherish 100 rupees, that this 100 rupee note we cherish, the other one we do not cherish. What is the reasons for that different? Although they have the same value, why do I cherish one and I don't cherish the other? Well, the only difference is because one is mine and the other one is not mine.
제사다 부모들 차박기 그때와디 다 내기세 선호들을 토대 인상 길을 교화마다 제사 딜라고 결함이 추어지는 되자기 강에 제기도 되자매고 서버 지다 추어지는 아니 나기세 다보쟁 나디 교화레스페 중생기 터네 로생기를 유해가와 디강의 양조 중생기 때버스 결함이 동행이 싸워도 때버스 샤게 되었습니다. 동행 카드들을 동행에 세르바 지다 추어지는 로아타와 대성탄은 대기라고는 대스 자신 충을 전에 동행스리기 유해가 잡으시다 추어신다 지는 동행이 싸워도 때문에 당시에 되었어.
So basically, with regard to our aggregates, with regard to this mind and body complex, well, it is because of our attachment towards mind and body. It's our attachment towards the aggregates that is the reason for all our trouble. That is why we experience problems and difficulties. So that's what we have to reduce. So on one hand, we understand we need to reduce this attachment, but on the other hand, there's the sense of mine. This is mine. So there's a natural sense, there's an innate sense of my body, my aggregates. And so basically, every time we kind of think about this, we stabilize this, we make this stronger, this sense of this is mine. And this is what we really need to deal with. So with regard to the attachment, what we really need to deal with is this, with the sense of this being mine, which we keep stabilizing, which we kind of familiarize ourselves again and again, we kind of stabilize it all the time.
디지털에 된대기 터네 아니 다 얘기 수봉 얘기 센 다보자 되니기 로가지 로지 로가지 다들 타데비다 뭐 타데비다 된지지 민두 세에 타셔바이나 신이 얘기 세에 요샤 세지 서면은 대두에 디지털에 신이 그리 되잖아요. 소도그레스.
So in this way, therefore, with regard to my body, my mind, the sense that there is an independent self, a separate self, a self that exists as being a different nature from mind and body. So once we understand that such a self cannot exist, then we can understand that what we perceive is mistaken. And when we understand that, based on that understanding, we can therefore then reduce or eliminate attachment.
디지털에 나단 얘기세디 단료리 따바레스 다디 남부지 계지 시험보다 료리 따바레스디라 라사시 이네 가르르 때네 따르시다 풍부르 때네 따 다와스 번나 동바지라 나다바이나 다디 주마이도 하고 두고봐 디 추버레스 하고 두고 다 Malana, Yana, Kitty, Yana, Milana, Tigo, Panatombachila, Yana, Chujaki, Michila, Milana, Tea, that normal rest, Tila to God. Tada, me who you said the Mirana, Chojini, Norvare, Tapare, Geshe already, Chojini, tell me, Geshe, the war.
So then with regard to I and mine, well, in general, from a Buddhist point of view, we label, the mind labels, the awareness labels I or mine. So here, this is what, based on what do we label I or mine? It is based on the aggregates. On the basis of the aggregates, we label I or mine. If we were to label it just on space, well then it would be obvious that we're mistaken. So taking I, or Geshe suggests, well, taking human, for instance, when we label human. Now, with regard to a robot, taking a robot, for instance, when you impute a robot when you impute human on the basis of this robot, it's quite obvious that we're mistaken with regard to that. But here we're talking about our sense of the person imputed on the basis of body and mind.
The Mirages, the Tabares, Karilla ten Taras, me Pungo de Tabares. And Pungo said, the Subure said, the Tabar, Krishajet in the Tabar. And then a Tabar, the Kazanaba, Tarim, that to change, that Chunjo, that Chunjuma put dealing. Delay Chashayana, the Edo Tabar, and the Samalu Tabayina, Tapanatoma Lava, she was having to say.
So then we impute the person on the basis of a human body and mind. So here, the person being imputed on the basis of mind and body, if then we take the basis of imputation, the body itself, again, that is just imputed on the basis of its parts. And then those parts in turn are again merely labeled, merely imputed on the basis of their parts. So you can trace it back, you can go further and further and further until you reach the subtlest particles, like a subtle particle, an atom for instance. So when you take an atom, again, actually that can be subdivided, and again, the atom has been labeled on the basis of its parts, and those parts have been labeled on their parts. So if you go on endlessly, you will never find anything. And so some Buddhist scholars, some Buddhist philosophers would then say, well, that is the same as labeling I on the basis of space. So they would therefore say that when you kind of go deeper and deeper, that subtler and subtler, at some point you reach a particle that is partless, the smallest particle that you can no longer divide. They would say this is the So therefore then they would say this is the ultimate, this is reality. So there's something that is no longer labeled on the basis of something other than itself because it can no longer be subdivided. That is the ultimate. And then based on that, all the coarser objects, they say, exists and appear to the mind. But then, with regard to that assertion, a question arises. If there's really the smallest particle, do these smallest particles, like two of them, if you have two of them, do they actually touch one another? If you have two smallest particles, do those two, can they actually touch one another? So then with regard to this question, can those two atoms actually touch one another? Well, there's two possibilities. Either they touch in one place, but not in another place, or the parts of each of these particles, they would touch everywhere. Every part of these particles would touch everywhere else. And then they would become one. They would be one. And on the basis of they're merging together into one, how could coarser particles or coarser objects arise from that? So that's the other possibility. Either they merge into one, or one part of one particle touches the other particle, but the other part does not touch the other particle. But that is again difficult because then it would have parts, and it would be in contradiction to their assertions that it's partless. Therefore, they come up with the solution saying they don't touch. They don't touch. Those partless particles don't touch.
다 말에는 자료 맞아나 안 그거를 또 뭐를 베스. 다 딜레이 뭐.
So if they don't touch, you can't bring them together. And so the question that arises is there space between them? Will there be space between those two particles?
다 딜라 아니 다 무슨 민다는 지도 대기 아니 두진 참여 유에스는 아주 좋다 지라마도 더 대바시 와 두진 참여 유에스 다 딜라 아니 지와다는 아니 저기 말했을 때 네가 로기다 자료 말했을 디지 잘 많이나 다 신에 디바로 또 뭐를 베스 다 지거들이
So basically, the Buddhist philosophers described as the Vaibhashika and the Sautantrika, they would say that they're partless particles. So with regard to the assertion of partless particles, the question that arises would be, can those two be attached? Can these two particles be brought together? And if not, is there space between them? That's the question that would arise.
딜라디스는 지라마와기 갈래우스나 다디바라를 동바여를 베스는 동바여리스 동바여나 자메나 아니 다 또또 대두마 알았다 시도를 봤어 레디전에 디시모 줘야디 제기 누가 야는 롱기 누가 같이 쿠츠 탱이 다 누가 저지 누가디게 인도스 주의지 아니 마시모 좀 대두고리스
So in response to the Vaibhashika would say that there is empty space between them. There is some space between those particles, but they do not. You cannot touch them. You cannot kind of put them together. So there's space in between. And then, in terms of the question, well, how, if you have space in between, how can those particles be the basic building blocks of coarser objects if they're actually not getting together? And in answer to that, they say it's from the point of view of the substance, it's from the point of view of the energy that keeps them together, and therefore they do become the smallest building blocks and are able to kind of their assembly leads then to coarser objects, or makes it possible to have like coarser objects. That's their response.
다 디네 네 대박이 다 딘제기 네 바나라 tomboy나 나 응차비가라 민버기 둘세 레루레 이마샤르가라 외기 둘레 그래 야도 가지 또도 차고 매네 둘려지 차로다 이메기 외대로 있네 제가 디레디 디바라 tomboyo 말이스 잘해요 말이스 지지는 나게 하다 잘해요 말이 tomboyo 말이다.
So then the followers of the Sautantrika, in response to that debate, they would say that nonetheless there are partless particles, but they say if those partless particles, if there was some empty space between them, then darkness could actually go in between, or light could go in between, and that doesn't make sense. And so they would argue they do not touch, but there's also no space in between. Now that's contradictory, saying that they do not touch, but at the same time, there's no empty space between them. That's actually a contradictory assertion.
다 디기 디기 켜내야 되다 아니 다 주도 고마다 센서바다 고마바레 군주기다 김제만 보고 디기 두진 샤시밍이 샤는 팀이 두스 다 디기 뭐 김제만 그거.
But then the Chittamatra, the Buddhist philosophers called the Chittamatrins and the followers of the Madhyamika, the Madhyamika system, they do not assert partless particles, and they set forth different reasons that supports the non-existence of those particles.
다 되게 라바나 신치기다 샤시 기시 자르기자 마시바 이네 무헬시 오지가 파 메템바지도 수 메템바지니 간드리야 두슬레다 샤시춘이 메바이나 파그면 추종명 샤시춘이 메바이나 왜 두스페온데 바이지나 레 무마레스 샤탐제 포로다 샤탐제네 로타나 콜레지나 요마르다.
So their arguments against partless particles would be, for instance, if there were an object, if there were a partless particle, a tiny particle, if it were partless, it wouldn't have different sides. And if it didn't have different sides, you could not have the sun or light coming from one side and then a shadow being thrown at the other side. That wouldn't be possible if there were a particle. Does that make sense? What I just said?
디나신다 비자제 용마라 차직들 투 차직들만 투는 비자제요. 차담제는 투 집어지게 수치게 집어투는 비자제 용마라. 비자제는 구조제요 말 구조제만이나 아니 치료조 충로조에다 파조 수조 남샤상마다 그랬어.
Another argument would be if there are no different sides with regard to this particle, you couldn't push one side and not push the other side. So you couldn't move things. And then, if that were impossible, then small particles could not be rearranged in such a way that they are moved and rearranged in order to form something coarser.
다 가실이다 딘지 두젠다가 카도메 이메나 아니 또 샤스케 미도스 요리 라마도 딘지 샤스 다 이드지 예 진짜 야 차시 차거로 또 보이네 차시데 가리네 고 And
others would argue, well, if these particles don't have a color or a shape, well, then they couldn't appear to the mind. We couldn't perceive them. And so therefore, if you say they have a shape, that's already a part, something other than itself. You have a part. So saying something has a shape means it's not partless.
다 차시 명예지 샤마도 차시 유명지 계제시 온디잖아요. 다 딘지기 주주세디 차시 디디들이 딜이 넣어서리게 양 계제시 온디야 주주세 명예지 차 온디잖아요. 아니 다다 센자베이 갈래도세요. 아니 셰벌이 넣어서 파전 수 넘버 때 디니지 자원이요 말이스. 추리된도 주거지요 말이스. 다 디레버다.
So then, with regard to these particles, now if they have parts, then which part of them is the particle? You have that question again. You cannot find anything because is it that part of the particle? Is it that one? What is the particle? So in response to that, therefore, the Chittamatrans, the minority school, they come up with this, or they explain this philosophy of phenomena. They set forth the philosophy of material objects not existing externally, but rather being a mere appearance to the mind. In the sense that these external phenomena, they do not exist as external phenomena, as in like separate from the mind. So what we perceive to be external phenomena, they do not exist externally as separate from the mind.
치료는 다 넘버때 등이 주님에나 다 요마리야 되기라와는 요마리라 되에네. 다 간제를 장미도 뭐 통구도 가르치디 다 민남당 지거레스.
So if they don't exist externally, we do have to say that they're there, they appear to us. And in response to that, they would say they're just like in a dream. We're just dreaming about these objects. So according to the view of the Chittamatra school, we're all dreaming right now. So there's actually nothing externally there. They're just these objects appearing to our mind like in a dream, according to this particular system.
다 딜레 노샤모 셰 다 간데스 추론이 되면은 간데스 통과하려고 바샤고 통과하겠어요. 근데 바샤를 지금 뭐지? 다 미담이다 통해 저들이 등이 바샤스. 이마다 춘중가다 yana 교화가마 가리네. 이마 통 윤교기 니버디 세베가샤 디다다 도스통 뭐랬어. 담시다 미담디 디제로 망치 미담디 니마치 진교지 바샤세 지마 통 뭐.
So then, there are a lot of different explanations with regard to this kind of philosophy. Now, the question that arises is why do these phenomena appear to our mind? And in answer to that, they say it's because of imprints. Different imprints we've left on the mind. So different imprints we've left in this life or in the previous life. And most of the appearances, when they're similar, this is because of an imprint that is described as an imprint that is of a similar type. So because of an imprint of a similar type, we have again and again similar types of experiences. But that's just like in a dream, and actually that's what happens in a dream, that we have a similar experience while we're awake, and then we have such an experience because of imprints that are similar, we have a similar experience while we're sleeping. So they use these examples to say this takes place all the time, that it's because of these different imprints that these different appearances arise.
다 디 코로나기 계제디 시에 있잖아요. page yore, that page lola chaya la yabo yore. Kisi pe korang la ichi meba yine, lola chaya la yabo yore, lola chana, page shinta la ichi.
So actually there's an example that they use. So in terms of making it easier for us, for this idea to arise to our own mind. And so if it doesn't arise easily, we can use a different example. But they use this one particular example.
Pedi karesena ani chupaba kala mi gita, haji gita, idaji gita yudisane, idagi gita diyo ni ana tomba, ana na chada, zokwa ikande wo tongo haris. Haji gita yudisane gyuji tongo haris. Mi gita diyo chuji tango tongo haris.
So the example they use is that of a vessel that is filled with liquid. So when a preta being, for instance, looks at that vessel, either they perceive it to be empty, or they perceive, in that vessel they perceive pus and blood. A celestial being would perceive ambrosia, would perceive nectar, while a human being would perceive water.
Jisanta di indizane, shirogu mwene tsunaba de diniji yuna, ta disumna nane ni norre la urwa. Suchi le norre la tuuma haris, ta di chibuchi yang haris.
So if there really was this liquid, if it existed in and of itself out there, if it existed out there, then two of those three beings must be mistaken, because it can only be either water or nectar or pus and blood.
Susigi milamna shinchin, susigi shibi paja siba wana joji na, and dikin duke yomare. Kora idadi paja sen na tubare, mi paja sen chu tubare, susi tumonde mato. So if you say that it's just like in a dream, that would explain that situation in the sense that there's no external object over there, but it's rather that it's because of the imprints that the preta being has due to their unique imprints, therefore they perceive this to be pus and blood. Due to the unique imprints of the human being, they perceive that to be water, and likewise with regard to the celestial being. So they all have their unique perception of this particular object due to their imprints. So actually, it would be better to have another example that is more contemporary, that's easier for us to understand. Kasa diji yore namachi. Kora kandisi kandi koro neji ga chingwa. Neji ga zhudu zane xingji tongwa, xingdongji. Xingdong di tong yinzang kora chöge di digang, xingdong ya da digang da gui yinzara. Mi sama cha tsiyayo, suju dian sonsi. Kari resi di, chöge di parnaga da xia sonsi. Parnaga da xia me pagi xingdong dusi. Chisa tadi kyausi raha ma yinba zhago So
there's a story of a lama who went to some mountain, as a form of a pilgrimage. And when he was near that mountain, there was like a tree. So in that area there was a tree. So he took his religious robes and put it up on that tree. And so other people came along and they started prostrating towards this rope. They were saying, he's just hung it in the space. He's just hung this rope in space. So they were so amazed at it, they generated faith because of this rope being just in space. And so the Lama said, no, I just hang it there. I just hung it there. So actually, from the point of view of this Lama, this particular Lama, he could see the tree. So this was the unique appearance of this tree, only he had. Whereas the other people couldn't see the tree, they could only see the religious robe. So to them, it seemed as if the religious robe was just kind of floating in space. So nowadays, there are not a lot of people who have miraculous powers. So, but actually, if someone has like miraculous abilities, then this would be a good example. This would be an example that could be cited.
딩이지 그런 세주야. 세비 다다 내 창이지 아니 배는 추가는 저도 추디 배 차고를 거. 저셔 뒤잖아. 아니 그 딩거. 그래서 코라 추가는 누가 코라를 차고지 또 시작하고 봐. 다가는 가면 차고디 가면 저대. 但미가 항상 가르쳤으면 이게 저것도 더 거잖아. 이게 항상 해자도. 이게 저거래.
So here, this is like with regard to, or the reason for being able to do these special, having these special abilities is because of very stable concentration. So if someone generates very stable concentration, they visualize in a space where there's, for instance, water. In a place where there's water, they visualize there to be soil, or they're like a ground, like a solid ground. And it's due to their concentration, very stable concentration, that this becomes what they perceive. They actually perceive solid ground, and they can walk over water. Because for them it's not water. For us what we perceive is water, but what they actually perceive is the solid ground. So with this type of very stable concentration, you were able to engage in these kind of special miraculous power, these special feats. You were able to kind of walk over water, etc. So while Geshe was at Drepung, while he was studying in Drepung, there were some Westerners who came. So the Western philosophers came to Drepung and gave a talk. So when they explained different Western philosophies, they talked about some philosophers that were very similar to the mind-only or the Chittamatra system. And then others were quite similar to the Madhyamika or middle way system. So at that time the monks were encouraged to ask questions, and when they were explaining, when they were describing the system, the Western philosophical system that is similar to the mind-only or the Chittamatra school, Geshe asked a question. So Geshe's question was, if phenomena only appear because of imprints ripening, then in the same way as, like usually when you see something, if you put it in front of you, then you can see it. When you put it to the side, you can no longer see it. But if it's merely because of imprints ripening, then you no longer have to put something aside in order to not be able to see it, or put it in front of you in order to be able to see it, because it's just imprints. If you have the imprint to see it, you will see it. If you don't have the imprint, you won't be able to see it. But that's the same for you in terms of the Chittamatra school, the other person says. So there's the same argument, the argument that you're bringing forth, you could apply this also to the Buddhist school of the Buddhist Chittamatra school. So Geshe said, like later on, he thought if he had to answer this from the point of view of the Buddhist Chittamatra school, how would he answer that? You thought about it. I think I understood it now. So Geshe said that in response to that, he was thinking, well, actually, when you dream about this, the scissors in front of you, like in your dream, either it's here or it's there. But actually, also this question with regard to the scissors, that will also be part of the dream. So it would not be separate. Even now, when Geshe answers this question, that would also take place in a dream. So it would be like you're like in this process of answering this question, both takes place in the dream. Like it's the dream within the dream, in the sense that basically there are those who are aware of something being a dream. So in the sense that both would take place in the dream. So you would ask the question, and then with regard to the scissors being here and there, they would all be part of the dream. So actually, going back to the Madhyamika system, so from the point of view of the Madhyamika school, it is said that phenomena, when you analyze them, you will not be able to find them. So those objects that we impute, that we label, those objects cannot be found. And actually, the sense that when you sit on a throne, for instance, so the sense of like, I myself am sitting on a throne, there's a sense of shock when you start, or like fear, when you look at this throne, in terms of this throne. So when you analyze it, you cannot find it. Why is there such a sense of like surprise or even fear? Because we have the natural sense that the eye is really there, but then the throne is not there. So we look for the throne, we cannot find it, but because of our strong sense of an eye, it's like the throne disappears, but the eye is still there. Now, with respect to the mind-only school, so their view is that phenomena do not exist externally, so that there's no external phenomena. But then there's only the mind that perceives those phenomena. And when they analyze the mind, when they kind of check the mind with regard to the mind itself, the mind, there's like there's an entity, or there's a mode of true existence, that the mind actually truly exists, while the objects don't exist externally, but the mind itself exists truly. Now, with regard to the mind-only school, therefore, they say the mind exists truly, but the phenomena don't. With regard to the Madhyamika school, the Madhyamika system, in general, they say that phenomena only exist because they appear to the mind. But then there are those, the Madhyamika Svatantrika, or as they're also described as the middle way autonomous school, they would say that, yes, phenomena exist merely through appearance to the mind, or they only exist by way of the mind, but they also can be found. They're not just merely labeled, but they can actually be found. Something can be found. So the consequentialists, that is the Madhyamika Prasangika, the high school, they would say that not only do phenomena only appear to the mind, they exist by way of appearing to the mind, but even within the appearance to the mind, even within that, they cannot be found. So they do appear to the mind, but they cannot be found. But then they do exist, so we need to explain how phenomena actually do exist. So they do not exist in the way Geshe said, but they still exist. So how do we determine that they exist? Well, if they're not contradicted by a valid cognition. So therefore, in that way, there are these different views, coarser and subtler views, from the point of view of these different Buddhist philosophical systems. Yes. And with regard to that, they set forth the explanation. They set forth the selflessness of the person and selflessness of phenomena other than the person. So basically, these philosophers, they explain selflessness of the person from the point of view of, once you realize that, on the basis of realizing the selflessness of phenomena, so selflessness of person, you eliminate afflictions and you attain liberation. Then the realization of the selflessness of phenomena, based on that, from the point of view of the selflessness of phenomena, you eliminate cognitive obscurations and attain the state of a Buddha. So this should be enough for today. If you have any questions, we've got half an hour left for questions.
So we have been looking at philosophies from various systems. So I would like to know, according to the Madhyamaka Prasamika system, which is the middle way consequentialist.
Yeah.
So the question has two parts. The first part is, in the view of emptiness or shunyata, what is their assertion on Buddha nature? And the second question is, doesn't this Buddha nature hint towards an Atman, inherent permanent self? And
A permanent self?
Inherent permanent.
Inherent permanent.
Which is contradictory to the Buddhist assertion of Anatman.
Okay. Should I repeat the question? So his question is, after Geshe explained different philosophical systems, his question is in particular with regard to the Prasangika, the Madhyamika Prasangika system, the middle way consequentialist system. So with regard to the view of emptiness, what is Buddha nature? And then when Buddha nature, the way Buddha nature is explained, doesn't that actually refer, the way the Prasangika school would set forth Buddha nature, wouldn't that imply like an inherently existent, an inherent and permanent self, and therefore be in contradiction to the view of Anatta? So from the point of view of Buddha nature, it's said to be twofold. So one is said to be naturally abiding Buddha nature, and the other one is expanding Buddha nature. So when we talk about naturally abiding Buddha nature, that refers to emptiness. So when we say emptiness, it's like it's described as the lack of inherent existence. So it's kind of like saying the lack of natural existence, as it can also be translated. So it seems like the lack of natural existence, that's the nature of things. So it seems to be contradictory to say, on one hand, phenomena lack inherent existence or lack natural existence, and still that is the nature of things. So there could be a misunderstanding in terms of seeing those two as contradictory.
That the teaching that the Geshe do that she never did the bodies love.
Oh.
The body is the young, the body was that's some way.
So to say in a different way, for instance, when we say lack of inherent existence, that is the truth. That is truth. So that seems to be seems to imply that phenomena exist truly, which seems to be contradictory. It's a truth, but it exists true, and it doesn't exist truly. So that seems contradictory.
Did the Duzane, that consultation body, same than the Tigua, same ranking body, same Giran. Any same ranking body, same ranking about Koran ranking to Vesna, Yamari. Same ranking body, same ranking about Koran the Dene, Zubarita.
So basically, the lack of natural existence of the mind is the nature of the mind. But it's not the nature of the lack of natural existence of the mind. Right? Why? Because the lack of natural existence of the mind is not the nature of the lack of natural existence of the mind, because it's actually because in relation to no, because it's not so the lack, I'll say it slightly differently. So the lack of inherent existence of the mind is not the truth of the lack of inherent existence of the mind, but it's the truth of the mind itself. So therefore, it itself actually exists falsely. It's not, so the lack of inherent existence is not the nature of the lack of inherent existence of the mind, is not the truth of the lack of inherent existence of the mind itself, because it exists falsely. So it itself is not its own nature, in other words. So the lack of inherent existence of the mind is not its own nature, it's the nature of the mind. So because it is in relation to the mind that it is its nature, so the lack of inherent existence is the nature of the mind, so it's in dependence on the mind that it becomes its nature, so it doesn't exist in and of itself as its nature because it's dependent on the mind. So that doesn't mean that the self exists. Just because that being the case doesn't mean that there is an existent self, an Atma.
In that same system, the Rike congregation, the Manzuta let on board the chapel, same Siri, the Chinele, the Vati, Chingo, Zimbabwe, Yandawi, this Mirages, and Jimatada said to this and Chetanji change and Chinjimolo charge, Sanjay,
But actually, when we talk about Buddha nature, usually it's easier for us to understand Buddha nature from the point of view of the clear and knowing nature of the mind. To say that our mind, its nature is to be clear and knowing, and it's free from the stains in the sense that they're not the nature of the mind, and that we can purify the mind from these stains and attain the state of a Buddha. That is for us easier to comprehend versus understanding that the emptiness of the mind is Buddha nature.
That the Maimba, same Ramani Tomba, the Rigeshe on this and Yanamenatas, Kazan Kitcher shops lava Nashinchini. Same the Ramani Yuena, and then George Yomare, Sandy, C. Yomare. Sir Ramani never Yinza, Digitone, Kiwataji, that's Sandy, Yon Shoy, Charles, the Digitone, and Sandy Rixi, Koale,
But saying that it's the lack of inherent existence of the mind, that this is Buddha nature, it comes from the point of view of understanding that if this exists, if the mind does not exist inherently, then it can actually engage in activities, it can function, it can be transformed such that it becomes the mind of a Buddha. So because it lacks inherent existence, therefore everything becomes possible. It becomes possible to transform the mind into the mind of a Buddha.
That the Maimba Chini, 간제다 semramone mebadi gomsha duzane ramone mebadi gomdi di sero jone se di bendi zodo di sanji di nyamcharo denjigi tone ko ale ko.
So also another way of explaining why the lack of inherent existence of the mind is Buddha nature is that once this becomes clear, so it becomes clear to us that this is the nature of our own mind. And when we finalize that clarity, in the sense that it becomes clearer and clearer and clearer, so once we reach this final level with regard to this being totally clear to our own mind, well, that is the level of Buddha. That's another way of looking at it.
So that's the sanji sem ramone mebadi da suse sem ramone mebadi moji res. Denjigi tone any some koyeju sir.
So therefore, the lack of inherent existence of the mind of a Buddha and the lack of inherent existence of our mind right now, they are of one nature. They are of one nature. They cannot really be differentiated. So from that point of view, we can also say that we can also understand that the lack of inherent existence of our mind is Buddha nature.
단도 슈르레기 제시디 르주문을 야부신규 등선신규 르주문 타마 뭐지 이메차네 산지기 레스 디기톤의 산지 루인버지 르주문을 야부지유 다 같이 제조는 등산 용문도 칸에 나가지는 셈도 차고.
So Geshe says this latter explanation, the explanation with regard to the two types of emptiness not being of a different nature, 10 years ago Geshe could explain this really well. Now he's just using those words, but it doesn't really appear to his mind. Whatever happened, but it doesn't appear as clearly to his mind as it used to 10 years ago. All of you improve more and more, your understanding gets better, Geshe's understanding is degenerating, it's declining.
When we do not differentiate objects, there seems to be still an observer in emptiness. So what I'm wondering about is there any difference between this emptiness and the conscious observer?
So you're saying there seems to be a difference?
Yeah, so I'm wondering
whether there's a difference.
또니도가 대제나 유다 유진이 켜봐서를 지어졌어. 유다 유진남나다 유동니까 안에지 유 칼로다 진불로다 오시라 상당에서라다 유 유진. 다 기니를 켜봐 열어봐. 유 유진.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to repeat the question. So to make sure also I understood it correctly. So you're saying in terms of the realization of emptiness, there still seems to be a difference between the mind that perceives emptiness and emptiness.
yes.
다 돈이 또 문제잖아요. 먼저다 배나 다 적지디 또 문제 적지 유의디 파줘도지. 아니 적지 통행이 로디 추줘도지. 적지디 미다바데 나바이네 디나시 미다바데 파줘도지. 디나시 다 차비요 말이.
So when you realize emptiness, so actually with regard to, for instance, you perceive this table with your mind. There is a sense, not only do you perceive this table, but there's also a sense the table is over here, the mind is over, the table is over there, and the mind is over here. Or if you think, for instance, of the impermanence of the table. So the impermanence is over there, the impermanence of the table is over there, the mind is over here. The sense of a distance. That is not the case with regard to perceiving emptiness.
제상 돈이 또비 커도 다가란다 돈이 또비로 코랑기 통주치네 디니 요체요 말. 무슨 말하다네 지요. 말하네 지도 그지.
With regard to when you realize emptiness, there's not that distance. There's not such a sense of the object over there, the mind over here. That difference is not there.
다 이네 돈이 또 사비제다. 다히 내기 생기니 다 보배 돈이는 보배기 다 내도 또송라디 다히기 생데의 유다 유진이 여버디 제다 통해요.
The young object is
말이. 또 코랑기 장치 동말로. 이네 유진이 여버디 제기 또 뱉다는 코랑이 대신 주제나 디비제 디유데스 디제게요.
So actually at the time when you realize emptiness, in that moment, there's no sense, from the point of view of that mind perceiving emptiness, there's no sense that the emptiness is over there and the mind is over here. But when later on, when you rise from that realization with another mind, you can still differentiate between the two. Oh, that was the object, that was the mind. So you can explain them differently.
repeat the question. There's one question with regard to emptiness. When he looks at the pillar, he sees these golden kind of garlands, you call them, right? This golden kind of painting. So he sees that, but then he also sees a stupa inside it. So your question is that a mistaken perception or not?
Is it a good is it the contemplation that goes towards understanding and how to go further? Or is it just my mind playing tricks?
Are you saying, is this a good example for emptiness?
Is it a good contemplation and how to go further?
Is that a good contemplation? Okay. Condition is 동리장 되니까 condition. 거기 가와딜라 주무요. 주무디 세르기 주무도 지어라. 다 초치네 다 세르기 주무도 주무도. 아직 정확하게 아직 통도. 다 초치네 세르기 통지라. 양 초시에 때나 양 초대수 통도. 뒷바지나. 오다 디기 초치네 디통 초치네 디통을 해야지. 뒷돈이랑 좋아요.
다 디페제토니 다 들어 열받을 샤초서.
So I kind of checked, does that connect to emptiness? That's how I put forth the question. And so he says, yes, actually there's a way in which you connect that to emptiness.
니 디네타도 얘기 담스라야 가기 가리기 닌지 뭐시다 통.
So for instance, when Geshe looks up towards the mountain, he sees these beautiful mountains up there, beautiful Dharamsala mountains.
이인들의 방기 지치는 디키들 두 스테우가 닌지 뭐 별로구나 hin지.
So actually when he looks at the mountain, there's like this kind of meadow in between, and then there are these mountains. So it kind of looks like a jewel when you look at the snowman, a triumph.
지금 담사라 거리시는 배 닌지 뭐시 나 러르티요.
So when therefore Geshe looks at the mountains, the thought arises, oh, the Dharamsala mountains are very beautiful.
근데 막 규대는 막 진짜 처음에만 진짜 결론을 찍다기서는 돈이
But then when he goes towards Thubten, like when he goes there and he sees the mountains from the backside, he's thinking, oh, it's so ugly.
진짜 대기를 통해도 지만 통해 되게 가라.
So what he sees, what he saw before and what he saw later on, very different.
다디 집에 전에 다다 비닝 지만 통해디 다 강기 차시디 뭐도 통해 말에 뒤에 이 방리 딜을 때 이렇게 더.
So basically, why did Geshe perceive this? The first perception, he perceived it so beautifully because there was this meadow and that was surrounded by the snow mountains. So because of that, in relation to each other, Geshe perceived them as being beautiful.
다 와는 다디 전에야 dakshish가 차시신다도 때네 아니야 통달로가 차다.
While if he looks at it from a different angle, well then he sees it differently. So the basis of imputation is differently, and therefore the perception is different.
이다 뒤전에 차시의 때네 예대버지나 강리시의 강리디 차시의 때네 예버지나 디네 통수미자도 와네 통수미자지 네가 여기 거기에 강리디 통에 내게 강리디 통에 개화계부터 차시의 때네 예버 많이 버지 강 통하다가는 강리 코랑 무연이지나 다 디니 강론직다 제가 말했다 야나 포베디 노리스 야나 나베디 노리스 기지들이에요.
So therefore, if his perception takes place in dependence on parts, so in dependence on parts, Geshe sees as one perception and then another perception when the parts are different. Well, if it's only in dependence on parts, then it's possible to have different perceptions. But if the mountains existed in and of themselves, then one of the perceptions would be wrong, would be a wrong perception if it were not to depend on parts. Is that enough?
And the second part about the eye.
Should we just wait? 거기 지금 이거 줘야 돼.
알아요. 양대신다지.
Okay, so give us a that's first.
나
Can you speak up? So what is the difference between selflessness and emptiness?
다 다음에 봤던 동반이 다 되다 찍어야 되지.
So actually, they're just different terms referring to the same. So they're synonymous.
이네 지라모도 또 대비기 쉬운나도다 마한시 다음에 봤을 때 지기 비슷한 거. 동반이 비슷한 거 요요. 마한시 다음에 봤을 때 지기 비슷한 거.
But in the by Bhashika in the Sautantrika school, in their scriptures they mainly talk of selflessness. They do sometimes use the word emptiness, but they mainly talk of selflessness.
다 주도 고마다 다음에 봐 도마니들 봐예나 취기단에다 가서다 니치아들이 다 되지고 자.
But then in the higher philosophical systems, when they differentiate between selflessness of person and selflessness of phenomena, then they take on the same meaning. Selflessness and emptiness have the same meaning.
Genla talked about the way to posit phenomena as existent. Genla talked about how the way we posit phenomena as existent, that is not contradicted by valid cognition. Could Genla maybe develop on valid cognition a little bit further, and what does it actually mean for a phenomenon not to be contradicted by it?
Time is not enough to give an explanation on those two.
파트너 지주링의 라그마르다 코트루다 제마마리다 요하 데킬라데 노르바 다 주시다는 요나 아티나는 아니 주시다는 요리 나오리나 미지 어디 지수장이 요나 주시다는 요리 다가라 주시다는 요리 두의 요리 계지시의 요리 거란들이 같이 제거한 디제일 때 마더로 다 타니노도 지비다 마더로 제마차데.
So from the point of view of conventional existence here, so when we talk about valid cognition, to just give you like a brief explanation, if someone were to look for Geshe Thubten Pasang, so if they were not aware that Geshe is here in Tushita, but instead they were to go to his monastery where he lives, to Techoling, well, now if they were to perceive Geshe Thubten Pasang to be down there in the monastery, that would be not a valid cognition, that would be wrong. But then, if they find out this was wrong, and so actually Geshe is not down there, but he's here, and they perceive him to be here, well, that would be a valid cognition.
That's the George, any Jojo Tonche, and the Mare Tenia. And then to them is anticipated, that is
So, if this person were to go to Techoling and were to meet Geshe-la's older brother, who looks very similar to Geshe-la, so if you were to meet him and you were to say hello, Geshe-la, and talk to him, his mind, that awareness that perceives his brother to be Geshe Thubten Pasang, that would be a wrong consciousness, it would not be a valid cognition or valid cognizer.
Jojo Tamdi Gore, and Rila Tam Chugore, and some desert image children, there's Kamucha Children, and Miji Yonje, and then Jojo, there's somebody to get
So one time, Geshe-la's brother, his older brother, who's usually a little bit more filled out. So when he was in retreat, during the retreat, he lost a lot of weight, so he looked a little bit skinnier. And as he came out of his retreat hut, someone came up to him and said, "Is this where your brother is staying?" So they thought it was Geshe Thubten Pasang, and they were asking him about his brother.
That's just a Kibajidoa, Kageti Chidi, Losheva, I should have foranged the Noshapsi.
So we can differentiate, therefore, between the time when he misperceived his brother to be Geshe-la, so that was a mistaken perception, it was not a valid cognizer. Whereas later on, when he got here, when he arrived here, and he perceived Geshe-la correctly, at that time his mind was a valid cognizer. This is called a conventional valid cognizer.
That Mahimba Machinje, any Canton any king go to the Messiah, send to the Messiah, to the Messiah Yomari, did the Chibuchikan to Yonje, to the Messiah of Zena, to the Messiah never Chibuchikan. To whom we need to talk to Gishe, Pagel never, she did never Chibuchikan.
If, on the other hand, this person were to approach Geshe-la's brother and were to check who is Geshe Thubten Pesana? Is it the head? Is it the legs? Is it the arms? They can engage in that kind of analysis, not finding Geshe Thubten Pesana, and doing the same analysis on the basis of Geshe Thubten Pesana himself, not his brother, and again engaging in this analysis. This is not Geshe Thubten Pesana, this is not Geshe, and so forth. Well, in that sense, it would be the same result. You would kind of come to the same conclusion that Geshe Thubten Pesana cannot be found.
제산다 바리디 아니 게 투데베사데 젬바이나 디타니 비세마싱 네르소 슈라 아타마 추샤세 데다 투데베사데나 타니 비세마기 네르소.
So in terms of whether his brother is Geshe Thubten Pesana, Geshe Thubten Pesana or not, well, in the first case with regard to his brother, this is mistaken. This is not a conventional valid cognition. While when looking at Genla himself and perceiving Geshe himself to be Geshe Thubten Pesana, that is a conventional valid cognition. Last question.
How do you cultivate detachment?
How do you cultivate detachment?
Yes.
작업이만 간데스.
차바다 지당 카두다 차바 메버스에나 강다 차서디 괜찮다나 차바 메버 차이로.
그 지원이나 참여가 좀 더.
카두 문주로 제바이나 강다 차바 제서디기 아니 괜찮다나 차바 총주로.
So kind of in a straightforward kind of way, but just reflecting on the faults of attachment. In that way, you can reduce attachment. That is, you can develop detachment.
제산다 칼라오레 베제나로 다 듀르 차고기 제시바이나 류미자와 상담다 뭐지 숨고요. 다 같이 나와도 지고 말을 해도 신고를 해지다데.
So, with regard to attachment to the body, for instance, so one meditation that is prescribed is looking at the ugliness of the body. There are some people that they don't like that kind of meditation, they don't like it. But actually it's something that needs to be understood, one should understand.
그래서는 로샤만나 하시 된데다 용거다 부부만 편지 차지 디게니 차네다 된다디 뭐 주비카도다 강에 시우체 용거 다 된다디 준다 지거리 Geshe 뭐 와체로 뭐 주비카도다 아니 코디 차버디 메모션은 강에 영화가.
So for instance, when you're young and like a boy and a girl, they meet each other and they have attachment, desire for one another. Of course, if everything turns out and they get together, okay. But if it doesn't turn out, if their attachment is not fulfilled, they experience a lot of problems, a lot of difficulties. So here in that case, reducing the attachment could reduce the problem, could solve the problem.
지상다 류미자와디 섬나땅제 베자나 시바나 신진의 니마를 튠숨 시진의 섬 딘다치 섬나땅다 히다기로 조사했다.
So if you think about here again I use a different word, not the ugliness of the body, but of the fact that the body is not clean. So of the uncleanliness or not lack of cleanness of the body, if you kind of reflect on that for a week or a month and so forth, so for an extended period of time, then your attachment for the body of the other person can be reduced.
지상다 되차 짬에 수에게 제시해보나 다기라바나신 되차기에 타도디 얘기 있어야 돼 두고도 지상다 다음에 섬나땅 미토네 신의 짬에 수도.
But with regard to totally eliminating attachment, so to abandon, to totally eliminate it, that's when you need to understand selflessness, because as Geshe explained before, it is the sense of my body which gives rise to attachment. So because of the sense of I and mine, giving rise to attachment, therefore that's what you need to remove. You need to understand selflessness.
베나다 수수 류미자와 섬나땅인지네 디기토네 류의 차신 매버 차지 류의 차신 매버 차세비 제다 시엘의 시마시다 메딩에다 아니 신규도 소를 담으로 주네 디카메시다 메딩에다 디고요.
No sé. So if you meditate on the unclean nature of the body, for instance, as a result of that, not only do you remove the attachment as explained before, but also it reduces your fear of death. Plus, it becomes easier to sacrifice your own body for others. to give up your body for the welfare of others.
근데 슈첨부 공면도 시대유도 하고 말이야. 슈첨부 시고 공면이나 아니 같이 찍고야 가르스나 대단 냠도 류디다 저기 때니 봐다. 신변주 두고요 봐다. 디윤데디 양성을 마다나 아니 신의 시케 비도르라 빈남의 쉐이다. 초진의 뭐 미사와 있네. 그게 제대로 토네 너무나 신이 자신고 있는 성단은 아니 착신 매되니 코순접 제대니 답답지를 두고.
But there is some danger. It can be the danger if you take it to an extreme level, which not everyone will do, but if you take it to an extreme level in terms of perceiving your body as unclean, as dirty, as ugly, etc., that you will neglect your body, no longer understanding that it's the basis for your precious human rebirth, as in like being the basis for the opportunities and leisures that you have, that you experience. And so, therefore, it is important to understand that from the point of view of its nature, it is unclean, it has lots of shortcomings, but from the point of view of its function, it is like a precious jewel. So it's important to kind of have a sense, have like a balanced sense of your body in the way just described. So this should be enough for today in terms of the session. So we conclude this session again with 2 dedication prayers. The meaning of the first one is, may the precious view of emptiness that has not arisen arise and grow. May that which has arisen not decline, but increase forevermore. And then the meaning of the second verse is, for as long as space remains, and as long as living beings remain, until then may I also remain to remove the suffering of living beings.